comments that you have, and then we'll launch into questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and it appears that maybe are we sharing my screen now? Can I share my screen? Alex?
Yes, sir, you should be able to do that.
Okay, I am going to share my screen. Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm honored to be here, and I very much appreciate the invitation from Richard and the work of Alex, and I am happy that you call me Lloyd. I just feel more comfortable that way, but I wanted to begin by just saying a few things about the book that grows out of my work on Lafayette. It is not a new book at this point. It's been out over 20 years, about 25 years, in fact. But I became interested in Lafayette as someone who could help us understand an entire era of European and American history. So I wrote this book called Lafayette in Two Worlds: Public Cultures and Personal Identities in an Age of Revolutions. And my goal was to understand why this man became such an important symbol, especially in the United States, but also in Europe. And this is the famous portrait of Lafayette by Ari Scheffer in 1824 that was presented to Congress and which still hangs on the wall of the House of Representatives. I know this community of Lafayette friends and Lafayette followers, we might say, are familiar with the main outlines of his story, but I want to just mention the themes of my book. I note that he came out of the rural part of France, of this town of Chavignac near Clermont-Ferrand in the Auvergne. He came to America when he was 19 years old. And there are these three great revolutions in his life: the American Revolution, and here he is at the time of his service in the American Revolution, a painting by Charles Wilson Peale from 1779, wearing the uniform of a Continental officer. And he became an extremely popular European in America because of the way in which he brought a kind of European status and support to this new emerging country. As you know, he married Adrienne de Noailles, who was from one of the most prestigious and distinguished families in France, when he was 16 and she was 14. There's another image of Lafayette with George Washington, which is the key to his popularity also in America, because he was seen as the kind of adopted son of George Washington. Here he is at Yorktown, and here at the famous painting by John Trumbull of the British surrender at Yorktown, and Lafayette here on the right side of the image we're looking at. After the war in the 1780s, he began his campaign to try to abolish slavery. He joined the French group called the Friends of Blacks. He worked to help this man, James Armistead, gain his freedom in the 1780s. And when he came back to America in the 1820s, he was seen as an advocate of abolitionism. He also, of course, in the 1790s became extremely active in the French Revolution, starting in 1789. We see him here with King Louis XVI and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. He was a great advocate of human rights, but then he fell afoul of the most radical factions in the revolution, and by 1792 he was fleeing for his life, and then he was imprisoned. Here is in Olmütz for a number of years in the 1790s, 5 years. But his wife, Adrienne, and his daughters joined him there in the prison after a couple of years. He eventually got out of prison, and after 1799 came back to this chateau, which is well known in the town of Lagrange because it is known as Lagrange. And there is the chateau as it appears today, where he lived basically from 1800 to the end of his life in 1834. He became friends with a number of prominent women writers, and this is also an important theme in my book because I felt that his relationships with women and intellectuals had not been adequately explored. So I wrote quite a bit about these women: Marie Malibran, who was an opera star, Lady Morgan, who was an Irish novelist, and Cristina Belgiojoso, who was an Italian political activist in the 1830s and 1840s. I know you're aware, most of you, of his great tour of 1824-25 and the souvenirs that were sold all over America when he went to all of the 24 American states, and how he mediated between the supporters of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams in this period of extreme polarization. And I mention that because I find him relevant to our own time, which is once again a time of extreme polarization, and we can talk more about that. After his death in 1834, I didn't really have a slide here of his involvement in the Revolution of 1830, but that was another and third important revolution. But of course, he remained a symbol of French-American relations, and at the beginning of the American involvement in World War I, here we see General Pershing, John J. Pershing, at Lafayette's grave in the Picpus Cemetery, and a famous song, Lafayette, We're Going Over. As you know, his image appears in many towns and cities around the country. These are three famous statues, the one at Washington, D.C. in Lafayette Square, the one in Fayetteville, the first town named for Lafayette in North America, and then in LaGrange on the other side. And of course, Lafayette Square remains a symbol of political activism. This is in 2020, we heard a lot about Lafayette Square, and we can talk more about how Lafayette and his advocacy of human rights might intersect with issues in our own culture today. The famous time when President Trump crossed Lafayette Square to a church across the way. And if people are interested in Lafayette, I want to recommend this new book by Mike Duncan, who I think has helped to bring Lafayette back to visibility these days. And finally, I simply want to note all of the towns and counties around the United States that are named for Lafayette, from Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Georgia, and I particularly want to note Walker County. I want to note Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Oregon. All of these places have towns and counties named for Lafayette, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Texas. And we can talk more about why he was so important, but the point is, he is still a figure to reckon with in the 21st century. So that's what I'm happy to talk about. Alex mentioned this as a lecture, but it's really a conversation. So thank you. And thanks again for inviting me to be here.
That's excellent. Thank you. So let's go back just a little bit. So the two now gone scholars of the 20th century of Lafayette, Louis Gottschalk and Stanley Atzerta, and you worked with Stanley Atzerta at Cornell. Would you tell us a little bit about Stanley Atzerta? What kind of man was he, your work on the Lafayette Papers, and what was your day like at Cornell?
So working with Stan Atzerta was one of the great pleasures of my academic life and my personal life, for that matter. Stan had grown up in the New York area. He went into the Navy when he was 18 years old. He was at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. Yes, he was a survivor of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This had a huge impact on Stan because he always wanted to understand the meaning of war, what wars were for, what they meant. So when I worked with him, I met him at Cornell at the end of my first year in the PhD program there. He was not on the faculty. He was the director of the Lafayette Papers Project in the library, where Cornell had accumulated thousands of copies of letters of Lafayette. So each day in my second and third year at Cornell, I would go to the library, and in the morning, I would meet with a team and we would pore over these letters. We each had a block of letters, a group we would each be given 2 months of letters, 2 or 3 months. And our job was to read through them, write notes, and provide information about the letters. So I came to Lafayette as a footnote writer, you might say. That's what I did with Stan. And then every day we would take coffee breaks and spend, I know, at least 30 minutes a day, just swapping ideas. Stan loved to talk about history, about politics, about philosophy, He also liked to talk about religion. He was a devout Catholic. And I think all of these aspects of his personality grew out of his experience at Pearl Harbor. He left Cornell around 1979 and went back to Minnesota, where he had been president of the College of St. Benedict, a Catholic college in Minnesota. And he decided he wanted to get back there, and he lived the rest of his life in northern Minnesota. He was a man who, he was crusty in some ways. He was kind of, he had a kind of wry sense of humor, but always he knew how to take details and turn them into big questions. And that's what I loved about working with Stan. We converged on that point.
That is a great thumbnail of Stanley Dzurda. I'd always heard that name, and I appreciate you informing me some about him. Let me ask you, you say in the preface, I know from experience that his letters, that is Lafayette's letters, can bring people together in our time. Explain that.
Well, what I meant by that was, all through Lafayette's life, he was an amazing letter writer. He wrote people on both sides of the Atlantic constantly. What I was referring to there was, first of all, he brought together a community of editors who worked on his letters. And secondly, when I said he can bring people together, as I got involved with Lafayette and as I began publishing on Lafayette, I would begin to get communications from people who would ask about some aspect of Lafayette's letters, or what he may have written to Thomas Jefferson or Washington. In fact, you might even say that Lafayette's letters brought us together because it is the mediation of Lafayette that remains an amazing network building part of a community of people in our society. I mean, the American Friends of Lafayette, your society in LaGrange, there's a very active society in Fayetteville. And in each of these places, people have read part of Lafayette's correspondence. They've read what he wrote to Washington or to Jefferson or to, other Benjamin Franklin, to other figures. So when I say Lafayette brought people together in his time, and he continues to do that today, I was alluding to the fact that he builds a community even now. And that to me is a sign of someone whose life and writings made a difference.
So whenever I saw you're having written that, I did wonder whether or not you had in mind telling his story, discussing his story, and the ideals his story represents might serve as a platform for unity. And that's what I read into that, and it seems like that's what you had in the back of your mind with that comment. Let me ask you about, you worked at, go ahead, you were about to comment.
No, I was just saying, I think people may agree or disagree with some of his ideas or with his actions, but he becomes a place, he's one of those people that we can think with, that's kind of the idea that important writers and leaders from the past give us an opportunity to engage with problems in our own lives by thinking with those people from the past. And that's what I find is helpful about Lafayette. And let me just say one other thing about that. When I came to Lafayette, by way of recent scholarship, there was a tendency among many historians to discount him as a significant or important figure, that he was not really a significant thinker or actor or mediator. So part of my interest in writing about Lafayette was to show how we could still use Lafayette to engage with the important issues of our own time, including human rights or democracy, or the meaning of literature and philosophy even, because in certain ways he tried to do that in his own life.
We're going to come around and drill down on that, but before we get away from the past and your studies, tell us a little bit about your work at Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and when you were there, was the spirit of Einstein still there?
Well, thank you. Yes, I had the great privilege of receiving a fellowship to spend a year at the Institute for Advanced Study. I worked with a colleague there named Peter Perret, who was a distinguished military historian, a great expert on Clausewitz, the theorist of war. And I don't know about the spirit of Einstein, although it was humbling. I must say, I remember the first week I was there. I don't know, this may seem like a strange thing, but I went in the old building, Fold Hall, and I saw where the, Einstein had been. And I remember going in the restroom and washing my hands in the restroom and thinking, I wonder if Einstein used this same, this is amazing. I'm in this restroom where maybe Einstein once used to come here. And I thought, this is as close to a genius as I've ever been. So yes, I mean, it was a humbling experience. I lived on Einstein Drive, and while I was there, my wife and I, we had two small children, and my son's first school was on Einstein Drive in the Einstein preschool. And I said, this is really a way to start your children on the right path,
Must have been spectacular. All right, let me ask you, you say here, quote, most of Lafayette's contemporaries believed he represented something larger than himself. What was it they believed he represented?
So that's one of the amazing things about Lafayette. I often called him a kind of symbolic text. He almost always did represent something more than his own self, something bigger than himself. So when he was in America, during the American Revolution, he represented to Americans the culture, the traditions of Europe, the social status of the European marquis, and as someone who affirmed to the Americans the importance of their cause, the importance of what they were doing. And they felt very insecure and uncertain. Are we doing the right thing? So he represented to the Americans the standing and stature of European traditions and culture. But then when he was in Europe, he represented something else. He represented the dynamism of the American Revolution, the ideas of the American Revolution. This is after he went back to Europe. And when the French Revolution began, he constantly evoked his experiences in the American Revolution, because he wanted people to understand that what he stood for was a set of ideas or ideals that were greater than himself. The kinds of things that appear in the Declaration of Rights, the rights of man and citizen, that all human beings have certain inalienable rights, that all people have the sovereign right to govern themselves, that people have the right to freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedoms to move freely in the world. These were ideals that Lafayette wanted to symbolize. Then when the revolution became more radical and divisive, he symbolized for the monarchist the dangers of revolutionary reform. But because he favored the monarchy, he symbolized to the radical Republicans the dangers of constitutional monarchy. In other words, he was both a symbol that people could embrace and a symbol that people attacked. And this became his lifelong experience. He ended up in prison. He got out of prison. In his later years, he was a symbol. He came back to America in 1824. He became a symbol of the revolutionary generation of George Washington, his friendship with Washington. During the Revolution of 1830, he became a symbol of the memory of the Revolution of 1789. When he welcomed Poles into France during the Polish Revolution of 1831, he became a symbol of representing French welcoming the Polish exiles and immigrants. He was a symbol who always understood that his own life represented something more than simply one man's actions. And this was the reason he got into lots of trouble, because people projected onto him both what they most admired, but also in many cases, what they most feared or most detested.
Let's talk about one of the phrases that you used, and you used it frequently in your book, and that's Lafayette was writing and became a symbolic text. That phrase, explore that a little bit, the symbolic text.
Well, I confess that when I was writing this book back in the 1990s, I was very influenced by methodologies in historical studies that were, it was called the linguistic turn in historical studies, in which people pointed out that the world is never just a material reality. It is always mediated by language. You know, when you can't describe anything without using words in some way. So the problem was that Lafayette became a story. That was why he became famous. All famous people are a story in some way. They become a text. And if you like that text, you will embrace it, you will support it, you will tell the story to others. But if you hate that text, you don't like that story, you will use that text to say, this is the problem, this is what we have to get rid of. So I used the phrase text. I was trying to think of some new way at that time to explain why Lafayette was significant. I was kind of reacting against the claim that, well, he's not really very significant. And I said, no, he's symbolically, he's like a text that millions of people were reading. He was like a bestseller, you know, this is significant. All these people were reading Lafayette to mean this or that. And in the book, I said, well, in the end, he became a shredded text in the French Revolution because he got chewed up and thrown away, you know, like an old text that people didn't want anymore. And so then he had to spend the, you know, his later years kind of rewriting the text or telling the story again.
So let's talk
That's
about
why
that
I use
framework.
the language, symbolic text.
So let's talk about that framework just a little bit in historians. So we said romance is a drama of the triumph of good over evil, virtue over vice, of light over darkness. But World War I gave way to ironic satire historians. Explain this and how it affected historians' view of Lafayette.
So again, when I wrote this, I was drawing on a sort of a more theoretical approach to historical studies, much influenced by the historian Hayden White. And he had argued that the older view of history was a romance. A romantic story is one in which a hero faces a set of obstacles. But in the struggle to overcome those obstacles, he or she, but usually these romantic heroes were male, transcends the obstacles and reaches a higher level of virtue, which people then can admire and celebrate. And this was the classic narrative of warfare in a way, the idea that war makes you heroic, you overcome adversity, you triumph. It's the romantic narrative of the American Revolution, for example. World War I destroyed romanticism, you know, the romantic view of war. It created a different view of war as it is always a story of a huge gap between hopes and expectations and reality. And therefore, heroes are a myth. And so one of the ways in which I was suggesting that this affected Lafayette was that the romantic narrative of Lafayette as a heroic figure overcoming obstacles was in effect demolished after the war. That all heroes gradually were torn down in a new kind of historical writing, which was more ironic, that pointed out people always fall short of their ideals. That's the ironic perspective. You set out to achieve goals, but in fact, you would be naive to think you're ever going to get to those goals. Only a romantic idealist could assume that. So if you are going to take a more ironic view, that is the view that every aspiration inevitably falls short of its goals, then Lafayette becomes a figure that exemplifies the folly of human beings. He thought he could create a stable constitutional monarchy in France, but that was impossible. He thought that human beings were basically good, but he was naive. He thought he could bring freedom to large groups of people, but he couldn't do that. You see, it's ironic in that Lafayette becomes an example of the inevitable gap between aspirations and reality, rather than a symbol of a heroic figure overcoming adversity and achieving his goals. That's the difference. Does that make sense?
It does, and it helps. Now, you also said that Gottschalk described Lafayette, and that description was a man that John Quincy Adams would not recognize. What did you mean?
Well, Louis Gottschalk is really the greatest of all the 20th century historians of Lafayette. I mean, he wrote 6 volumes. He did meticulous research. But one of his main themes was that the ideal, the narrative of Romanticism was that Lafayette had fled from France to come to America to support the high ideal of freedom and independence and human rights. And Gottschalk went back and looked at the stuff. He said, actually, he was just a young guy who was kind of unhappy at the court. He didn't dance very well. He didn't have a good job. He didn't get along with his in-laws. It doesn't sound very heroic. Gradually, after he came to America, he began to understand these ideas. But and then he also wrote a book about one of Lafayette had an affair with Aglaé de Arnoldstein, and he kind of wanted to chip away at the idea of a man of extreme virtue. And I don't think Gottschalk was hostile to Lafayette, but I do think he set out to systematically deconstruct the romantic narrative that had been inherited from the 19th century.
So how do you reply to, is that still current, the ironic satire? Because that strikes me as a framework, a perspective. And how do you reply to that?
So, I mean, I think it's a delicate thing. I certainly don't think we should just simply restore some idea of a romantic hero who is flawless. You mentioned John Quincy Adams, and when Lafayette died in 1834, John Quincy Adams gave the eulogy for Lafayette in the House of Representatives in Congress. And he said something like, I could pull up the quote if I got out the book, but, look back upon the history of mankind. Has there ever been a greater man, more, unselfish, more willing to help his fellow man since the time of Christ himself? And it's like, whoa, I mean, this is
over the top.
Yeah. So but there were many Americans who thought this in 1824 or 1830, like Lafayette's the greatest man in the world. So it seems to me that the challenge is to recognize the achievements of past people, and this isn't only true of Lafayette, but I'll take him as an example. But then also to recognize their humanity, their flaws. Lafayette, he had blind spots like everyone else. He probably was naive about the abolition of slavery. He made mistakes. He bought this plantation in French Guiana, and he made mistakes. So the point is to engage people, to recognize their mistakes, not just dismiss them, with the irony that presumes one has a higher position of knowledge and people in the past are more naive than we are. That's truly the ironic perspective. The romantic perspective is they were just flawless. So somehow a good historical work has to weave its way between these extremes, of complete demolishing or rejection of the ideals themselves even. Oh, that's naive, it can never be done. And the other extreme that just idealizes someone in a kind of hagiographic celebration. So that's what I've always wanted to do with Lafayette, is find that middle way.
One of the comments you make is Lafayette thus seems to attract more respect and interest from the general public than from scholars. So why should that be? And do scholars on that account have any greater claim on accuracy?
Well, scholars, of course, like everyone else, they have their own frameworks and their own perspectives. If a scholar wants to use Lafayette for some purpose, they usually will place him in some kind of a framework. I just read a book actually called "So You Want a Revolution." Have you heard of this book? I think the guy's name is Shiro. I shouldn't bring up the name of the book without mentioning it. Somebody could find it easily. You Say You Want a Revolution. He talks about what happens to moderates in revolutions. It's a very interesting book, actually. I think he's responding to the extreme polarization of our current moment, that moderates have very little hope in radical or revolutionary situations. And he calls it the Lafayette syndrome. And it's sort of like Lafayette is the model of what happens to moderates in every revolution. They think they can, first of all, they begin by condemning the old regime and its flaws and its corruptions. So at the beginning, they're at the head of the revolution. But pretty soon, because they start hitting setbacks, they're surpassed by more radical people, and they're destroyed. Lafayette's destroyed. Kerensky's destroyed in the Russian Revolution. Moderates were destroyed in every revolution. So I mention this as an example of how scholars use Lafayette to make arguments that are important to them for other reasons. Maybe they want to say, the moderate position is vulnerable. Maybe they want to say Lafayette didn't understand the importance of economic reforms. You can use Lafayette for any reason you want to. The general public, when I say that, and here I'll say, like the American Friends of Lafayette, most of the great friends of Lafayette in America are not spending their years pouring through the archives trying, oh, what did Lafayette do here or there? They want to just understand, well, what did he say and what did he do? And I think if you're not trying to make Lafayette serve some theoretical or academic purpose, it might be easier to accept him as a figure you simply want to celebrate, or at least engage with or honor.
So
And
let's
scholars want to be more skeptical. Let me put it that way. Scholars want to be more skeptical.
Fair enough. So what most endeared Lafayette to American friends, you say, and earned him a place among the nation's founding heroes was his personal style. What was his personal style?
So this is one of the interesting things about Lafayette. When he came to the American colonies, to America, I said that he represented aristocratic social status from France, but he was a remarkably unpretentious person. He just hung out with the guys down at the camp. He ate American food. He did not complain. He didn't tell Washington or the other people, this is what you should do. He listened to what the Americans were trying to do. And I think this is why he was respected, because he, as I argue in the book, he was a listener. Now, in his later years, when he was an older man and he had dinners at Lagrange, I'll use the French pronunciation, at Lagrange.
That's all right.
One of his grandson-in-laws, Charles Remesat, wrote about going to dinners there and how he just kind of pontificated, the old man, Lafayette. This is what happens to all of us, I guess. You get to a certain age. And everybody just sort of listened. And Remesat said it probably would have been more interesting if people had challenged him more, or if there had been more discussion. But even in those years, he was remarkably unpretentious. I just use that word because, and this is no knock on the French nobility, but okay, maybe it is a little bit, people who thought of themselves of a certain social class who didn't really want to deal with people who weren't like themselves. Lafayette was not like that.
And maybe I might add, one of the initial stories that established that was when he was accompanying Washington, I think, and Washington felt, whenever Lafayette first saw the Continental Army there, that the army was not in the best of shapes, to which Lafayette replied, "I'm here to learn and not to teach." And from that, Washington took a cue, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think it totally impressed Washington, because every other Frenchman who came through his camp was there. So here's what you need to do, you know.
Now,
Here's what you need to do, General Washington. And wait, he just said, "You are my teacher. I'm here to learn."
So let's define a couple terms that were important to Lafayette. One is a term that's fallen into disrepair lately, and that is disinterested. And the other is glory. It has a different connotation today. Define for us disinterested and glory from Lafayette's perspective.
So what people meant when they used the term disinterested was that he acted for reasons that did not seem to serve his own self-interest. Like, he spent all his own money to come to America. He served without pay in the Continental Army. He had no obvious reason to benefit from what he was doing, you know, except that he could receive glory. So that's the link to glory. He was part of a generation, you know, there was a famous essay by a man named Douglas Adair called Fame and the Founding Fathers. And by the way, it was Stan Itzerda who brought this essay to my attention. Stan loved this essay because it says, it was written, you know, quite some time ago in the 1960s, maybe, I can't remember. It said that what motivated so many of the people of that generation was the idea of posterity. And for example, Lafayette had read Plutarch's biographies of ancient heroes. And the idea was that what matters most in your life is not whether you accumulate a certain amount of wealth or you get a particular reward at this moment, but whether you create some kind of action that will be honored, that will be remembered, that will bring you glory. So the glory isn't that, you know, it's like 15 minutes of fame on TikTok, if I may make a contemporary analogy, or it's not the glory of passing celebrity that we have so much of in our culture now. The idea is that it's something that will endure based on some substantive action that makes a difference in the world. We might even say that makes the world a better place. So glory would come to that generation if they could construct a new republic founded on a set of ideals that somehow evoked the traditions of, I don't know, Roman Republic, or the glory of the democracy in Athens, or glory would come to people who did something that mattered and that lasted. And that would come about by disinterested activity. You know, Washington was the other person. It's often called the Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, the ancient Roman figure who, you know, had led the Roman armies and then just went on, okay, now I'm going to go cultivate my fields. I don't need to be in power. I don't need political power. And this was a model for Lafayette. One reason he often withdrew was like, I don't want to be Napoleon. That's not my goal. So that's disinterested and glory, and the two concepts are connected.
And let's talk about his 5 years in prison. You have a different turn on that. So here's what you say: the years of imprisonment and exile, 5 years, therefore became an important transitional period. Lafayette was forced to stay in one place, to think about failure, to be alone, and to read books. So Lafayette, tell me, transitioned from what to what as consequence of his imprisonment?
So, yes, I mean, Lafayette had always been on the move, obviously. He was not really so intellectually astute, let's say. He listened. He gained his knowledge mostly from talking to people, listening to people. 5 years in solitary confinement, or just with a few people, forced him to come up against the idea of failure. He had always known so much success, right? And let's say failure, this is an old cliche, failure is a great teacher, right? When we fail, it forces us to look at some parts of ourselves and to rethink what caused that failure. I'm not saying Lafayette, turned into a completely different kind of person, but from that point on, I do think he recognized more clearly the limits of what he could do and of what any society could do. He was devastated by what happened in the French Revolution. I mean, not only that he failed and had to flee for his life, but that the parliament, the system that he thought he was setting up was overthrown within a year. A constitutional monarchy with an assembly, with a legal process for making government policies. All of this was overthrown by mobs overthrowing the elected officials, essentially. And I think it made him more aware of the limits of what political reform could do. Not that he ever broke from the idea of reform. In some ways, he became even more idealistic. But I do think he became more reflective and more aware of the limits of what could be achieved.
So it seems to me that you suggest in there that Lafayette was forced to take a, quote, undistracted moment to think it through, and that important things have to be thought through. And that whole phrase, undistracted moment, it was forced on him to good effect.
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to be thrown in prison for 5 years, but no one can go through such an experience, I think, without it having an effect in some ways on your self-understanding. Now, this is one reason why, he's often condemned for what he did in 1830. In 1830, there were people who thought that France might reestablish a republic. And Lafayette was determined not to let the same thing happen that had happened in the period between 1789 and 91, or especially between 91 and 92. And his goal was to stop the revolution at a point that he thought would manage to keep the peace, that would not lead to violence of the kind that happened in the first revolution. He was condemned, and of course, even to this day, ever since then, Republicans have condemned him. When I say Republicans, the more radical factions of French political culture said he was a traitor. He betrayed the revolution in 1792, and he betrayed the Republicans or the revolution in 1830. I think Lafayette believed that you had to be realistic about how fast a society could actually change. And, he was often called naive, but in fact, he was pretty much of a realist as to what could really be achieved. And I think that was the sobering lesson of the Jacobin Revolution, which, by the way, destroyed his wife's, his wife's mother and grandmother, his wife, many members of the Noailles family, which is why he was buried in Picpus, the cemetery of people who died en masse in the revolution during the terror.
When he was imprisoned, so he read Samuel Richardson's Clarissa twice out loud. So Clarissa, by some accounts, is the 16th longest novel in history. So it's some 1 million words. Tolstoy's War and Peace is like 600,000. Did he ever make comments about his reading of Clarissa and insights that he gained from that reading?
I never read anything about in later years where he said, this reminds me of Clarissa. I think you know, for people who haven't read Clarissa, and I would assume that's probably everybody who's part of this conversation now, it's a story of a young English woman who was held captive in effect by her family and then tried to escape with a man who said he would protect her, and then the man raped her, and it was a terrible, tragic story. Why did he read it twice? He had a lot of time on his hands, and that book, if you had a whole year to read a book in prison, maybe that would be a good one to go for. But I will say this, he had an interest in literature. I mentioned he was friends with novelists. He was friends with Germaine de Stael, with Lady Morgan, with a number of novelists. And this is something I think that's never been fully appreciated in Lafayette's life. He saw the value of literature as a vehicle for explaining what human beings do, how they react, what their emotions are, what their relationships look like. And even though his own life was really driven by politics, and first by warfare, then by politics, he was interested in literature. So let's imagine, I don't know the effect of Clarissa per se, but I do know that when he got out of prison, he became good friends with Germaine de Stael, who was an important novelist. He befriended other novelists in his later years, like Lady Morgan. He was sensitive to women writers in a way that many men of his generation, especially political and military leaders, were not sensitive. Can I say that that was because he spent months and months reading one of the longest novels ever written while he was in prison? I cannot. But let's just between you and me, let's imagine that's why. By the time he finished Clarissa, he had changed his understanding of human nature just a little bit, thanks to literature.
One comment you make here is that Lafayette's deism differed from Tracy's atheism. Tell us a little bit about Lafayette's deism. Was he a spiritual man?
No, he was not a spiritual man. This was one of the few ways in which he and his wife differed. His wife was a very devout Catholic. This is something I used to talk about with Stan and Zerda as well, because Stan was very interested in the questions of deism and the Enlightenment, and I think because of his own Catholicism. And Lafayette was not someone to believe so much in spirituality or spiritual levels of life. I think this is one reason why he was so driven toward worldly achievements. He believed that a person's immortality came from their actions, from their glory. He was a deist in that he was kind of a child of the Enlightenment, and he thought, well, there must be some explanation for why the universe is here, and I will just say there was some watchmaker or something, you know, that created it. But he was not a spiritual person, not in the sense that his wife was, certainly not in the way that Catholic thinkers of his generation were spiritual.
So did he ever comment that he felt there was a higher power? Did he use the term God, or was he more nuanced?
I never remember seeing him. I don't remember his discussing that in his letters. Now, I certainly have not read all his letters, despite my time in poring over a lot of them. You know, when he took his tour of the United States in 1824, 1825, you know, American culture was far more religious in the Protestant sense then. And when we go to a town, he was often invited, he would go to church, you know, that this was something that was important to show that he was supportive of the religious community. So he often did go to church, but I never read comments from Lafayette that this was something that meant a lot to him. It was like another performative act, you know, like you have to greet the mayor, you need to greet the veterans in the community, you need to go to dinner. And as a way of affirming your respect for the community, you should probably go to church as well. Sort of like in our own time, there are plenty of politicians who I think have no religious feelings at all, but they want to portray or they want to go to church, let's say, to affirm their respect for the values of the community.
So we're nearing the chiming hour here, and my last question, which will come after the next to last, why does Lafayette matter today? Hold that one for a second. But you also comment that if we choose to dismiss ideas, Lafayette believed the future could be better than the past. And you comment, it's the last sentence in your book, published in 1996. If we choose to dismiss such ideas as naive or absurdly romantic, however, we may also be choosing to abandon our most valuable democratic legacy from the past, as well as our aspirations for a better, more democratic future. How do you see America is doing on this account today compared to 25 years ago when you wrote that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think the reason I have always been interested in Lafayette is that I see him as a person we can think with. That's why, to come back to that term, as we're looking for allies in the struggle to defend democracy. I wrote that in the later 1990s because I felt that political culture at that time was already turned into a kind of celebrity thing, into a advertising campaigns. We were going through already in the 1990s this extreme polarization. We'll call it the Newt. This is in reference to Georgia here. The Newt Gingrich, Bill Clinton conflicts that actually launched the political culture we live in today. That is, that you cannot find a way to work with your opponent. You've got to destroy your opponent. And the way to do it is using the media, using cable TV. These were all the things that were happening already at that time. How do I compare it to what has happened now? I mean, in the age of social media, in the age of absolute take no prisoner politics, I would say that we are in a far more dangerous situation. And I can't imagine what Lafayette would say. You know, just to take the example of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, this is exactly what he most feared in the time of the French Revolution. I said, you know, he couldn't accept that. The crowds invading the halls of the French parliamentary system. He would be appalled that this would happen, and that would even be supported by people, you know, who were in leadership positions. So I think Lafayette is someone to go back to in this time when democracy, not only in the United States, but around the world. I mean, look what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. We are in another catastrophic moment for democracy. And so this is why I wanted to write about Lafayette, even though I couldn't imagine that the world would look like it does now. But I would still say what I said then. If we do not hold to those ideals, and that's what I think Lafayette represents, if we do not defend those as worth our time and our effort, then our society and other societies will lapse into anti-democratic or even authoritarian systems. And that's what happened in France, and it's not what Lafayette wanted, but it's what happened.
So let me claim bow tie privilege before that very last question. Did Tocqueville and Lafayette meet face to face? Do they have conversations?
Yes, they knew each other. They through shared circles of people in Paris, but they were never close friends. Although Tocqueville went to Lafayette and asked him for letters of recommendation when he came to America on his famous tour of 1831. And he actually brought letters from Lafayette.
Now, and Tocqueville was concerned about the extremes of radical democracy. Why did that not concern Lafayette?
Well, I think actually Lafayette did have some concerns about radical democracy. That would be, you know, direct action, like mobs, if you call that democracy, overthrowing the elected assemblies. He was a liberal. He wanted process. He wanted reform. He differed from Tocqueville, though, in that Tocqueville believed more clearly in an aristocratic elite as the proper governing class for the society. Lafayette was much more sympathetic to, let's say, middle class, even lower class people, as long as they understood and accepted that they had to be part of a process, not, a revolution that just burned down the buildings. And I just to say why, I think it's because Lafayette had the experience in the American Revolution of working with soldiers and innkeepers and restaurant owners and people who were not of the elite, which Tocqueville had not had as a young man.
So the last question, let's summarize. Why does Lafayette matter today?
Well, I think this would build on what I said before. I feel that the struggle to defend and affirm democracy is an endless struggle. Democracy does not come readily or easily. And in this kind of world, we as 21st century people need allies from the past. And Lafayette is an ally. Lafayette is someone who believed in human rights. Lafayette is someone who respected people. Lafayette is someone who gives us a model of how, even as you hold your beliefs strongly, you can still engage with people who have different beliefs, which has to be part of a democratic system. And above all, Lafayette had ideals that we can make progress toward a better society in the future through our human actions. And for these reasons, without being naive or celebratory about Lafayette, as a human being, he is someone who provides a model for the determination to keep working year after year, decade after decade, so that the long arc of history bends towards justice, if I may quote Martin Luther King. And I think that's what Lafayette believed as well.
Dr. Kramer, it has been a pleasure. I would recommend that folks just below their badge that says I've been vaccinated also ought to have a badge that said I've read Lloyd Kramer's book twice. It's been a pleasure.
I don't know, Alex, that might require an additional medicinal intervention, at that point. But it may be a little too academic for most people's taste, but I'm honored. I'm deeply honored by your respect for the book.
Alex, you are up.
Dr. Kramer, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful hour, and I will say your answer to the last question there was inspiring, and I really am already starting to see kind of taking that clip and making a video, like an inspirational video. It's perfect. I'm sitting here kind of thinking through, how are we going to do this? This can, start our next program or something. So it was great. But nonetheless, we do have several comments coming in, thanking you and saying a wonderful talk. There is a comment here saying that the book Prisoner of State by Paul Spalding is a must to read to understand how he suffered during those 5 years, as well as Adrienne, and a super writer and book. And we not only agree, but we were fortunate enough to have Paul Spalding with us last year for our speaker series. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you can see that video as well as this one tonight once we add it by the end of this weekend. We do have 2 questions that have come through, and I'll start with the latest and go to the oldest. As a letter of Adrienne Lafayette reveals, it was British Prime Minister William Pitt II who was the reason for Lafayette's prolonged indefinite imprisonment. Why do most modern historians neglect to mention this key member of the triumvirate of Lafayette's captors fact?
So the question is suggesting that Pitt did not want Lafayette to get out of prison, and that he he was supporting, for example, the Austrian monarchy in keeping Lafayette in prison. I have to say, I do not know. I don't know the details of that. I mean, I can imagine that the British, let's just say this, the British never had much love for Lafayette because, well, there's a history there, you know, like in all unhappy relationships. They couldn't forget that Lafayette had been a thorn in their side. So I don't know the details to that. It's just beyond my reach, but I would say the British had never been great fans of Lafayette, and that keep him in prison would not have disappointed the British government.
Sure thing. Another question here. Do you know anything about British Empire War I propagandist and British establishment aristocrat John Matif? CBE took complete control of Chavignac, and how grave markers on all Lafayette family graves in Chavignac are erased, yet only grave markers of the British John Matif, CBE, and his dog are the only grave markers not canceled at Chavignac.
Well, again, I don't think I'm the person to answer that question. I do not know too much about the markers or the graves there. I mean, we have people in the audience here who have more detailed knowledge than I do about these matters. So
sure.
I don't know what, I know that it was used as a hospital there. In fact, I met someone not too long ago who had a relative who had been at Chavignac in a tuberculosis hospital there, for many years. But I just don't know all the details about what happened there in the years of the 20th century, early 20th century. Sure. I did get a chance to go there once. It's an interesting place, but I don't know the details about the removal of the names or the markers of the graves. I just don't know. Yeah. I apologize.
Yeah, it's new to me. It's something I was wanting to look into. Of course, we have comments here. Thought-provoking, love this presentation, Merci beaucoup. And then Alan Hoffman said, good job, Lloyd. Oops, Dr. Kramer, I should say.
Well, let me just say about Alan Hoffman. He knows more about Lafayette than anybody I know. So, or as much about Lafayette as anybody I know. There are a lot of people who know a lot about it.
Yep, he's with us tonight. So, it's great to have you. So one more question for you. From Alice Hood, who encouraged Lafayette as a child to become who he became?
Oh my, that is a really interesting question. Because we know Lafayette's father died when he was 2 years old. Lafayette never really knew his father. His mother died when he was about 12 years old. He was raised in part by his grandmother. There were a lot of important women in his life. Yep. These women encouraged him, supported him. I think when he was in school, he had teachers, a mentor who gave him I mentioned Plutarch's biographies of ancient heroes. This made a huge impression on Lafayette. It was common for young men of the nobility to be educated in this kind of classical literature. But I think all of this gave him an interest in heroic action. Here would be an interesting psychoanalytic question. Why was he so determined to make a name for himself? Could it be because as a child, he lost his father and his mother at a very early age? He learned about the fragility of life, from that experience, and how fleeting it is. And he became obsessed with the idea in a way of making a name for himself. Maybe a name that would live on. So who taught him that? I would almost argue that there could be very complex psychological and emotional components to that desire for fame and glory.
Well, it has been a wonderful evening, Dr. Kramer, and we want to thank you again for joining us. And we hope that if you're ever in the LaGrange area that you'll stop by and let us know.
I definitely will, and I want to come see that beautiful statue of Lafayette in the town square there.
Absolutely, and we'll even let the Lafayette scholars climb into the fountain, but that's a secret only for the Lafayette scholars.
I don't want to jump in the fountain, but maybe I'll throw a coin over my shoulder.
There you go. Very well. Thank you everyone for attending this evening, and we hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.